Welcome to True Crime Stories by Pam. Today we're diving into one of the most audacious frauds in Hollywood history, a story of ambition, deception, and a $690 million lie that fooled hundreds of investors. This is the tale of Zachary Horwitz, a struggling actor who became Zach Avery on screen, but off-screen he was performing the greatest con of his life. From his modest beginnings in Indiana to a $5.7 million mansion in Beverly Hills, from forged Netflix contracts to FBI handcuffs, this is the complete story of the Hollywood ghost. Buckle up because this one is absolutely wild. April 6, 2021. The sun rises over a pristine $5.7 million mansion in Beverlywood, one of Los Angeles's most exclusive neighborhoods. Inside, Zachary Joseph Horwitz is probably still asleep, surrounded by the trappings of success, luxury furniture, expensive art, a lifestyle most people only dream of. At 9:47 a.m., a convoy of black SUVs pulls up to the mansion. FBI agents emerge, their windbreakers catching the morning light. They walk past the manicured lawn, past the fountain, and knock on the door. When it opens, they utter the words that will end the performance. "Zachary Joseph Horwitz, you're under arrest for wire fraud." The contrast is striking: handcuffs in a multimillion-dollar home, federal agents in a neighborhood where security is supposed to be guaranteed. As Zach is led away, neighbors peek through curtains trying to understand what just happened. How did a working actor, a man with a beautiful wife and a seemingly successful production company, end up in FBI custody? The answer is as complex as it is shocking. Zachary Horwitz had built an entire empire on lies, and that empire was about to come crashing down in spectacular fashion. To understand how we got here, we need to go back to the beginning. Zachary Horwitz grew up in Fort Wayne, Indiana, a solidly middle-class upbringing with a father in business and a mother who was a homemaker. By all accounts, Zach was a normal kid. He played sports, had friends, did well in school. But there was always something else. A restlessness, an ambition that seemed too big for Fort Wayne. In high school, Zach discovered theater and it clicked. On stage he could be anyone, anywhere, anything. He could leave Zachary Horwitz behind and become someone powerful, charismatic, larger than life. After high school, Zach enrolled at Indiana University studying acting and business, an interesting combination that would prove prophetic. In the mid-2000s he did what thousands of aspiring actors do every year. He packed his bags and moved to Los Angeles. He changed his name to Zach Avery, a sleek, marketable stage name that sounded like it belonged on a movie poster. And then came the auditions. Hundreds of them. Thousands of them. He landed small roles in low-budget films, bit parts you'd miss if you blinked. He appeared in Fury with Brad Pitt, The White Crow, and Last Moment of Clarity, but none of them were breakout roles. None of them made him a star. And that rejection, that constant reminder that he wasn't good enough, had to sting. Every con artist has a first lie, a moment when they cross the line from exaggeration to outright fabrication. For Zach, one of those early moments involved a juice bar business pitch. According to reports, Zach claimed he had a meeting with Howard Schultz, the billionaire founder of Starbucks, to discuss a business opportunity. He even showed people an email that appeared to be from Schultz's team, expressing interest in the concept. It was impressive. It was professional. It was also completely fake. Zach had fabricated the email using nothing more than Microsoft Word and some basic formatting skills. This might seem like a small lie, inconsequential in the grand scheme of things. But it reveals something crucial about Zachary Horwitz. He understood the power of perceived success. If people believed he was connected to Howard Schultz, they'd see him differently. They'd take him seriously. And if a fake email could create that perception, why not use the same technique on a larger scale? This was the seed of what would become a massive fraud, the realization that people don't always verify, they just believe. And if you can make them believe, you can make them invest. Around 2013, Zachary Horwitz founded a company called 1in Capital LLC. The name itself was a clever piece of marketing, 1 in a million. It sounded exclusive, aspirational, like you were getting in on something special. The company's stated purpose was to license film distribution rights for territories like Latin America, Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. Zach told investors that he had exclusive partnerships with major streaming platforms, Netflix, HBO, Amazon Prime, to distribute films in these regions. Investors would fund the licensing deals and in return, they'd receive substantial returns on their investment. It sounded legitimate, professional, and lucrative. But here's the devastating truth. None of it was real. There were no licensing deals. Netflix had never heard of one Capital. HBO wasn't partnering with Zachary Horwitz. The entire operation was built on forged documents and fabricated relationships. Zach created fake contracts with HBO and Netflix logos, complete with signatures and legal language that looked authentic. He set up email accounts that appeared to come from executives at these companies. He provided detailed financial projections, payment schedules, and revenue forecasts. Everything looked professional, legitimate, airtight. And because film distribution, especially international distribution, is opaque and complex, most investors didn't think to verify his claims. They trusted the documents, the emails, and most importantly, they trusted Zach. One of Zachary Horwitz's first major investors was someone he knew well, a friend from his college days, someone we'll call day trader Jake. Jake and Zach had been through everything together. They'd partied together, studied together, dreamed together. When Zach moved to Los Angeles to pursue acting, Jake stayed in touch, always supportive, always believing in his friend's success. So when Zach came to him with an investment opportunity, Jake didn't hesitate. This wasn't some stranger pitching a scheme. This was his best friend offering him a chance to get in on the ground floor of something big. Zach showed Jake the contracts, the projections, the emails from Netflix executives. He explained how the international film distribution market worked, how one Capital was positioned to capitalize on the streaming boom. The returns looked incredible, sometimes as high as 35 to 40% annually. Jake was impressed. He invested a significant portion of his savings, and then he did something even more valuable. He referred Zach to other potential investors. Friends, family members, business contacts. Jake became Zach's best salesman, vouching for his friend's legitimacy and success. And why wouldn't he? He trusted Zach completely. But that trust would eventually cost Jake everything: his savings, his reputation, and perhaps most painfully, his friendship. Here's what makes this story both fascinating and terrifying. Zachary Horwitz didn't use sophisticated technology or complex hacking techniques to create his fake documents. He used Microsoft Word. That's it. He downloaded Netflix and HBO logos from the internet, formatted them into professional-looking letterheads, and typed up contracts that appeared to be worth millions of dollars. He created fake email addresses that looked legitimate at first glance, addresses that mimicked real executives' names but were hosted on slightly different domains. The forgeries weren't perfect, but they didn't need to be. They just needed to be good enough to pass a casual inspection. The psychology here is crucial. When people want to believe in something, they don't scrutinize it too closely. They see what they want to see. Zach's investors saw professional documents with recognizable logos and assumed they were authentic. They saw email addresses that looked official and assumed they were real. And when Zach spoke about the film industry with confidence and insider knowledge, they assumed he knew what he was talking about. The truth is, most of us wouldn't think to call Netflix directly to verify a contract. We'd assume that if something looks legitimate, it probably is. And that assumption is exactly what Zach was counting on. Netflix was the crown jewel of Zachary Horwitz's deception. In the mid-2010s, Netflix was exploding in growth, expanding into international markets, spending billions on content. Everyone wanted a piece of the Netflix pie, and Zach told investors that one Capital had it. He claimed that his company had exclusive agreements to distribute Netflix content in Latin America and other territories. He showed investors contracts that detailed these arrangements, multi-million-dollar deals with payment schedules, revenue projections, and legal terms. The documents looked so official that investors never questioned them. The genius of using Netflix as his fictional partner was that it added credibility to everything else. If one Capital was working with Netflix, it must be legitimate. If Netflix trusted Zach, why shouldn't the investors? The Netflix name became a seal of approval, a validation that made every other claim seem more believable. And as the money started flowing in, first hundreds of thousands, then millions, Zach used some of it to pay returns to early investors. Those investors, thrilled with their profits, told others about the opportunity. They became walking testimonials to Zach's success. And the scheme grew larger and larger, fed by the very returns Zach was paying out with new investor money. As if Netflix wasn't enough, Zachary Horwitz also claimed partnerships with HBO. He told investors that 1MM Capital had secured distribution deals for HBO content in various international markets. Like the Netflix documents, the HBO contracts looked legitimate, complete with logos, legal language, and what appeared to be signatures from HBO executives. But Zach took it one step further. He created fake email accounts that mimicked HBO executive addresses. When investors had questions or wanted updates, Zach would send them emails from these fake accounts, providing reassurance and detailed information about upcoming deals and payments. The fake emails were particularly insidious because they created an illusion of ongoing communication with real companies. Investors weren't just seeing static documents. They were receiving what appeared to be real-time updates from HBO executives. If they asked about a delay in payment, they'd get an email from HBO explaining the issue. If they wanted confirmation of a deal, they'd receive professional correspondence that seemed to verify everything Zach had told them. It was a masterclass in deception, layering lie upon lie, creating a web so intricate that it became almost impossible to see where the truth ended and the fiction began. There's a moment in every Ponzi scheme when it crosses a threshold, when it goes from a small-time con to something massive and unstoppable. For Zachary Horwitz, that moment came when he received his first $1 million wire transfer. Imagine the feeling. You've been scraping by as a struggling actor, watching your bank account dwindle, and suddenly there's a 7-figure deposit. For most people that would be terrifying, the weight of the lie, the knowledge that it's all fake. But for Zach it was validation. It meant the performance was working. With that first million came a transformation. Zach wasn't just pretending to be successful anymore. He was living like it. He bought luxury cars, first one Ferrari then another. He moved into upscale homes, each one more impressive than the last. He wore expensive clothes, ate at the finest restaurants, and traveled to exotic locations. To the outside world, Zach Avery was a man who had made it. And maybe in those moments Zach believed it himself. Maybe he convinced himself that this was real, that he deserved this lifestyle, that somehow he'd find a way to make it legitimate before the whole thing collapsed. In the midst of building his empire of lies, Zachary Horwitz married Mallory Hagedorn. Their wedding was lavish, expensive, picture-perfect, the kind of ceremony you'd expect from someone who appeared to be a successful Hollywood producer. Mallory was beautiful, supportive, seemingly devoted to Zach and the life they were building together. But here's the question that haunts this story. Did she know? Did Mallory understand that their mansion, their lifestyle, their entire existence was funded by fraud? Or was she just as deceived as everyone else? Mallory would later claim complete ignorance, saying she had no idea what Zach was doing. She portrayed herself as another victim, someone who trusted her husband and was blindsided by his crimes. And maybe that's true. It's entirely possible to live with someone and not know the darkest parts of their life. But it's also hard to imagine living in a multimillion-dollar mansion, driving luxury cars, and never asking questions about where the money came from. The truth about Mallory's involvement or lack thereof remains one of the most debated aspects of this case. What we do know is that their marriage, like everything else in Zach's life, was built on sand. One of the most brilliant aspects of Zachary Horwitz's scheme was his choice of territories. He claimed to be distributing films in Latin America, Africa, Australia, and New Zealand markets that were far away and difficult for investors to verify. If an investor wanted to check whether a film was actually being distributed in Brazil or South Africa, how would they do that? They'd have to navigate foreign websites, deal with language barriers, and understand different distribution systems. Most people simply didn't have the time, resources, or expertise to verify Zach's claims. So they took him at his word. But here's the thing. The films Zach claimed to be distributing either didn't exist or weren't being distributed through his company at all. He was licensing ghost movies, titles that sounded plausible but had no real distribution deals attached to them. When investors asked about specific films, Zach would provide detailed information: production budgets, cast lists, projected revenues. He'd show them marketing materials and distribution schedules. Everything looked legitimate. But if you actually tried to find these films in the territories he mentioned, you'd come up empty. They were ghosts, figments of Zach's imagination, existing only on paper to justify the money he was taking in. As the money poured in, Zachary Horwitz's lifestyle became increasingly extravagant. The Ferraris multiplied. At one point he owned several luxury vehicles worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. He purchased the $5.7 million mansion in Beverlywood, complete with every amenity imaginable. He took private jet trips, stayed in five-star hotels, and wore designer clothes. To anyone watching, Zach was living the Hollywood dream. And that was exactly the point. Every purchase, every display of wealth, served a dual purpose. It satisfied Zach's desire for luxury, and it reinforced the illusion of success for his investors. Think about it from an investor's perspective. If you gave money to someone and then saw them driving a Ferrari and living in a mansion, you'd assume the business was successful, right? You'd think, well, clearly he knows what he's doing if he can afford all this. But the cruel irony is that Zach could only afford these things because of the money investors were giving him. He wasn't paying for his lifestyle with profits from legitimate business deals. He was paying for it with their money. Every Ferrari, every vacation, every luxury purchase was bought with investor funds that were supposed to be generating returns. Instead, they were generating a facade, a performance of success that kept the scheme alive. Here's a detail that's almost too ironic to believe. While running his multi-million-dollar fraud, Zachary Horwitz continued taking acting classes. That's right. Even as he was performing the greatest con of his life, he was still trying to perfect his craft as an actor. He attended workshops, worked with coaches, and continued auditioning for roles. On some level, Zach still believed that his real success would come from acting, that one day he'd land that breakthrough role and finally achieve the fame he'd been chasing all along. The irony is devastating. Zach was so committed to becoming a successful actor that he couldn't see he was already giving the performance of a lifetime. Every meeting with investors was a scene. Every fake email was a line of dialogue. Every forged document was a prop. He was acting every single day, playing the role of a successful Hollywood producer so convincingly that hundreds of people believed him. If he'd put the same energy and talent into his legitimate acting career that he put into his fraud, who knows? Maybe he would have actually made it. But instead, his greatest performance would be the one that destroyed his life. Most con artists, when caught, claim they had good intentions. They say they were trying to help people, that they planned to pay everyone back, that circumstances just spiraled out of control. And while we can't know exactly what was going through Zachary Horwitz's mind, there are indications that he may have convinced himself of a similar narrative. Perhaps he told himself that the fraud was temporary, that once he landed a major acting role or secured a legitimate distribution deal, he'd be able to pay back all the investors and make everything right. In his mind, he might have been borrowing, not stealing. This kind of self-deception is common among white-collar criminals. They create elaborate justifications for their actions, convincing themselves that they're not really hurting anyone, that everything will work out in the end. But the reality is far different. Zach wasn't borrowing money with the intention of paying it back. He was spending it on Ferraris and mansions. He wasn't working on legitimate deals that would save the company. He was creating more fake contracts to bring in more investors. The Robin Hood delusion, the idea that he was somehow taking from the rich to eventually give back, was just another performance, this time for an audience of one, himself. There comes a point in every Ponzi scheme where it crosses the point of no return, where the lie becomes so big that there's no way out except collapse. For Zachary Horwitz, that moment came when the fraud reached $200 million. At that level, the scheme required constant attention. Zach had to manage hundreds of investors, track their expected returns, create fake documents to explain delays, and most importantly, find new investors to pay off the old ones. It was a full-time job, except instead of building something real, he was maintaining an increasingly unstable house of cards. The mathematics of a Ponzi scheme are unforgiving. If you promise investors a 35% annual return, you need to bring in at least that much in new investment just to pay them back, plus enough to fund your own lifestyle. As the total amount invested grows, the amount you need from new investors grows exponentially. By the time Zach's scheme hit $200 million, he needed tens of millions in new investments every year just to keep it going. And he couldn't just stop. If he stopped bringing in new money, he couldn't pay the promised returns and investors would start asking questions. He was trapped in a nightmare of his own creation, pedaling faster and faster on a bicycle that was always about to tip over. The first serious threat to Zachary Horwitz's scheme came when an investor asked for an audit. This investor, more sophisticated than most, wanted to see actual proof that the distribution deals existed. They asked for contracts, payment records, communications with Netflix and HBO, real documentation, not just the glossy presentations Zach had been providing. For most con artists, this would be the end. How do you provide an audit when nothing is real? But Zach didn't panic. He did what he always did, he performed. Zach scheduled a meeting with the investor and brought an entire presentation. More fake documents, more fabricated emails, more explanations about how the distribution business worked and why certain information was confidential. He used his charm, his industry knowledge, and his sheer confidence to deflect the audit request. He suggested that demanding such detailed information showed a lack of trust, and emphasized all the returns the investor had already received. And incredibly, it worked. The investor backed down, satisfied for now. But the crack had appeared. And once you see a crack in a con artist's armor, it's only a matter of time before the whole structure starts to crumble. By 2019, Zachary Horwitz's scheme had become a mathematical impossibility. He owed hundreds of millions in promised returns to investors, but he had no legitimate revenue coming in. Every dollar he paid out came from new investor money, and the gap between what he owed and what he was bringing in was growing wider every month. Financial experts who later analyzed the scheme described it as a black hole of debt, a gravitational pull so strong that no amount of new investment could escape it. Zach was essentially trying to fill the Grand Canyon with a garden hose. The stress must have been enormous. Imagine waking up every morning knowing that you owe hundreds of millions of dollars to people who trust you, knowing that if you don't bring in enough new money today, the whole thing collapses tomorrow. Imagine the constant fear, the paranoia, the weight of the lies pressing down on you. And yet Zach kept going. He kept meeting with new investors, kept showing them the fake contracts, kept promising returns he knew he could never deliver. Whether it was desperation, delusion, or sheer stubbornness, he couldn't bring himself to stop. And so the black hole kept growing. When COVID-19 hit in early 2020, the world changed overnight. Businesses shut down, the economy collapsed, and suddenly everyone's financial situation was uncertain. For Zachary Horwitz, the pandemic presented both an opportunity and a crisis. On one hand, it gave him a perfect excuse for delays. He could tell investors that the pandemic had disrupted international distribution, that Netflix and HBO were postponing deals, that payments were delayed because of the global crisis. And many investors, facing their own pandemic-related financial stress, were surprisingly understanding. They gave Zach more time, more patience, more trust. But the pandemic also made it much harder to find new investors. People were scared, holding on to their money, not interested in risky investments. And without new investor money, Zach couldn't pay the returns he owed to existing investors. The scheme started to crack. Payments that were usually on time started arriving late. Then they stopped arriving at all. Investors who had been patient for months started asking harder questions. And Zach, running out of excuses and running out of money, started to realize that the end was near. The pandemic, which had briefly seemed like it might save him, was actually accelerating his downfall. As the scheme began to unravel in late 2020, Zachary Horwitz became more desperate and more creative with his lies. When investors demanded to know why their payments were delayed, Zach sent them elaborate apology emails that appeared to come from Netflix and HBO. These fake emails explained that the pandemic had caused unforeseen complications in distribution, that payments were being processed but delayed, that everything would be resolved soon. The emails were professional, apologetic, and completely fabricated. Zach was now forging corporate communications to cover for the fact that there were no distributions, no deals, no money. What's remarkable is how detailed these forgeries became. Zach created email chains that appeared to show ongoing negotiations between 1MM Capital and major streaming platforms. He fabricated internal memos from Netflix discussing payment schedules. He even created fake legal documents showing disputes that were supposedly delaying payments. Every lie required 10 more lies to support it, and the web became so complex that even Zach must have struggled to keep track of it all. But he couldn't stop. Once you start forging corporate documents to cover your tracks, you've crossed a line that there's no coming back from. Every massive fraud eventually ends because someone decides to verify the story. In Zachary Horwitz's case, that someone was an investor who had grown increasingly suspicious about the delays and excuses. After months of promises and postponements, this investor did something simple but devastating. They picked up the phone and called Netflix directly. Not an email address that Zach had provided, but Netflix's main corporate line. They asked to speak to someone about distribution deals with 1MM Capital. And the response they got changed everything. Netflix had never heard of 1MM Capital. They had no distribution agreements with the company. They had never communicated with anyone named Zachary Horwitz. In fact, the executives whose names appeared on Zach's fake emails didn't even exist in some cases, and in others they had no knowledge of any such deals. The investor hung up the phone, their world shattered. Everything they had believed, every dollar they had invested, every assurance Zach had given them, it was all a lie. And they weren't the only victim. There were hundreds of others who had trusted Zach, who had believed in the dream he was selling. The whistleblower's next call was to a lawyer. And after that, to the FBI. When Netflix's legal team learned that someone had been forging their documents and impersonating their executives, they didn't take it lightly. Corporate fraud of this magnitude isn't just a civil matter. It's a federal crime. Netflix contacted law enforcement and provided them with everything they knew. They had no relationship with 1MM Capital, no distribution agreements, no communications with Zachary Horwitz. They also identified the forged documents and fake email addresses that had been used to deceive investors. HBO did the same. Both companies made it clear that they were victims too. Their brands had been hijacked to perpetrate a massive fraud. For federal investigators, this was a gift. They now had two of the world's largest media companies confirming that the entire foundation of Zach's business was fraudulent. They had documentation showing the fake contracts, the forged emails, the fabricated deals. And they had a growing list of victims, investors who had lost tens of millions of dollars. The FBI opened a formal investigation into 1MM Capital and Zachary Joseph Horwitz. They started following the money, analyzing bank records, interviewing investors. And what they found was staggering. This wasn't a small-time con. This was one of the largest Ponzi schemes in Hollywood history, with losses totaling $690 million. As the investigation intensified, some investors decided they couldn't wait for law enforcement. They wanted answers directly from Zach. One of those investors was day trader Jake, Zach's best friend from college. Jake had lost everything: his life savings, his retirement, money he had borrowed from family members to invest in what he thought was a sure thing. And he had brought other people into the scheme, people who now blamed him for their losses. Jake called Zach and demanded a meeting. And in that meeting, the masks finally came off. According to those who knew about the confrontation, Jake was furious, devastated, and desperate for the truth. He asked Zach directly, was any of it real? Were there any actual distribution deals? Was there any money left? And Zach, perhaps realizing that the game was finally over, couldn't maintain the performance anymore. The reports suggest he admitted that the deals weren't real, that he had been using new investor money to pay old investors, that everything was falling apart. Jake, the man who had trusted him most, who had vouched for him and brought others into the scheme, felt betrayed in a way that's almost impossible to describe. Their friendship, built over decades, was destroyed in a single conversation. Federal investigators are very, very good at following money. When they started analyzing Zachary Horwitz's bank records and financial transactions, they found exactly what they expected. Investor money flowing in and then flowing right back out, not to film distribution deals, but to personal luxury purchases. Millions of dollars went to buy the mansion in Beverlywood. Hundreds of thousands went to purchase Ferraris and other luxury vehicles. More money went to private jets, designer clothes, expensive vacations, and high-end restaurants. Zach had been living like a Hollywood mogul, but he was doing it with other people's money. The paper trail was devastating because it showed clear intent. This wasn't a failed business where someone made mistakes. This was deliberate theft. Zach wasn't investing the money in film rights or distribution deals. He wasn't even trying to make the business work. He was taking investor funds and using them to finance a lifestyle he hadn't earned. Every wire transfer, every purchase, every transaction created a record that proved he knew exactly what he was doing. When federal prosecutors eventually built their case, the paper trail would be the foundation. It was impossible to argue ignorance or good intentions when the evidence showed millions of dollars flowing directly from investor accounts to luxury car dealerships. In the final weeks before his arrest, Zachary Horwitz knew the walls were closing in. Investors were demanding their money back. Lawyers were sending threatening letters. The FBI was asking questions. Zach had to know that arrest was coming, and yet he didn't flee. He didn't try to hide assets in offshore accounts or disappear to a country without extradition. Instead, he stayed in his mansion, living the lifestyle he'd built on lies, almost as if he was waiting for the inevitable. In the 48 hours before the FBI raid, Zach reportedly tried to secure one last massive investment, money that might buy him time or provide an escape route. But by then, word had spread in investment circles that 1MM Capital was in trouble. No one was willing to give him money. His options had run out. On the morning of April 6, 2021, when those FBI agents knocked on his door, Zach must have known this moment was coming. The question is, was it relief? After years of maintaining the lie, of constantly looking over his shoulder, of knowing that every day could be the day it all came crashing down, was arrest almost a release from the pressure? We'll never know for sure. But when the handcuffs clicked shut, the performance was finally, definitively over. After his arrest, Zachary Horwitz was interrogated by FBI agents. While the full details of that interview remain sealed, what we know is chilling. Zach reportedly maintained his composure, speaking calmly about the business, explaining how the scheme had evolved over the years. He didn't immediately confess, but he also didn't maintain the lie with the same conviction he'd shown investors. Perhaps sitting in that interrogation room he finally saw himself clearly, not as a successful producer or a misunderstood entrepreneur, but as a con artist who had destroyed hundreds of lives. The agents asked him about the forged documents, the fake emails, the millions of dollars in personal spending. They presented him with the paper trail, the undeniable evidence that he had been running a Ponzi scheme. And slowly the masks fell away. The charming producer became a man facing the reality of his crimes. The confident businessman became someone who understood, perhaps for the first time, the magnitude of the damage he had caused. In that room there were no more performances, no more audiences to convince. Just Zachary Joseph Horwitz, confronting the wreckage of his choices. Behind every dollar of the $690 million fraud is a human story. There were retirees who lost their entire life savings, planning to spend their golden years in comfort but now facing financial ruin. There were families who had invested their children's college funds, trusting Zach's promises of high returns. There were small business owners who put their company's reserves into what they thought was a safe investment. And there were people like day trader Jake who not only lost their own money but had convinced friends and family to invest, carrying the weight of those losses on their conscience. During the sentencing phase, several victims gave impact statements. They spoke about sleepless nights, about marriages strained by financial stress, about retirement dreams shattered. Some spoke about the betrayal they felt, how they had trusted Zach, believed in him, thought he was helping them build a better future. One elderly investor described having to return to work at 72 years old because Zach had stolen his retirement. Another talked about losing their family home. These weren't just numbers on a balance sheet. These were real people whose lives had been devastated by one man's greed and lies. Zachary Horwitz pleaded guilty to one count of securities fraud in October 2021. By pleading guilty, he avoided a lengthy trial, but he couldn't avoid the consequences. The federal sentencing guidelines for a fraud of this magnitude were severe. Prosecutors asked for the maximum sentence, arguing that Zach had shown no remorse, that he had deliberately targeted vulnerable investors, and that the scale of the fraud demanded serious punishment. Zach's defense attorneys argued for leniency, claiming he had psychological issues, that he had gotten in over his head, that he wasn't a violent criminal. In July 2022, Judge Mark Scarsai sentenced Zachary Joseph Horwitz to 20 years in federal prison. The judge called the fraud egregious, and noted that Zach had shown a shocking lack of empathy for his victims. 20 years. Zach was 34 years old at the time of his arrest, which means he'll be in his mid-50s when he's released. The prime years of his life will be spent in federal prison, paying for a performance that no one wanted to see end the way it did. Along with the prison sentence, Zach was ordered to pay $230 million in restitution money that realistically the victims will never see. One of the most frustrating aspects of the Zachary Horwitz case is that much of the money has never been recovered. Federal investigators seized the mansion, the Ferraris, and other luxury items, but when those assets were liquidated, they covered only a fraction of what investors lost. So where did the rest of the $690 million go? Some of it went to paying early investors their returns, classic Ponzi scheme behavior. Some went to maintain Zach's lavish lifestyle. But hundreds of millions simply disappeared into the financial void. Forensic accountants combed through years of financial records, tracing money through multiple accounts and transactions. But Ponzi schemes are designed to be confusing. Money comes in, gets mixed with other money, gets paid out in returns, and by the end, it's almost impossible to track where every dollar went. Some victims hold out hope that hidden assets will be discovered, that offshore accounts will be found, that somehow they'll recover their losses. But the reality is grim. Most of the money is gone, spent on a lifestyle that existed only as long as new investors kept believing the lie. After Zach's arrest, Mallory Horwitz filed for divorce. In court documents, she claimed she had no knowledge of her husband's crimes, that she believed he was a legitimate film producer, that she was as shocked as everyone else when the FBI showed up. Mallory portrayed herself as another victim, someone who had trusted the wrong person and was now left to pick up the pieces of a shattered life. Some people believed her. After all, con artists are skilled at deception, and it's possible to live with someone and not know the full extent of their criminal activities. But others were skeptical. How do you live in a $5.7 million mansion, drive luxury cars, and take private jet vacations without ever questioning where the money comes from? How do you not notice that your husband's film distribution company never seems to actually distribute any films? The truth about Mallory's knowledge and involvement may never be fully known. She was never charged with any crimes, which suggests that investigators didn't find evidence of her participation in the fraud. But the question lingers. Was she a victim, or was she willfully blind to the source of their wealth? Either way, her life, like so many others touched by Zachary Horwitz, would never be the same. The story of Zachary Horwitz raises profound questions about ambition, identity, and the American dream. Here was a man who wanted success so badly that he was willing to fake it on a scale that almost defies comprehension. He wasn't content to be a working actor, to build a career slowly and legitimately. He wanted the mansion, the Ferraris, the lifestyle, and he wanted it now. So he created a performance, the greatest role of his life, and for a while, everyone believed him. But unlike a movie where the credits roll and the actors go home, this performance had real consequences for real people. We're fascinated by stories like this because they reveal something uncomfortable about human nature. We want to believe in success stories. We want to trust people, especially when they're charming and confident. We want to think that we'd never fall for a con, but the truth is hundreds of smart, successful people believed Zachary Horwitz. They believed because he was good at what he did. And that's the scariest part. The line between a successful entrepreneur and a con artist sometimes comes down to whether the promises are real or fake. Zach's promises were fake, but his performance was Oscar-worthy. Now he's in federal prison, and his victims are left wondering how they ever believed the Hollywood ghost. Thank you so much for listening to this deep dive into the Zachary Horwitz case. This story is a stark reminder that not everything that glitters in Hollywood is gold. Sometimes it's just an elaborate illusion built on lies. If you enjoyed this episode, please hit that like button and subscribe to True Crime Stories by Pam. Your support helps me continue bringing you these in-depth investigations into the cases that shock and fascinate us. Drop a comment and let me know what you think. Was Zach a master manipulator from the start, or did things spiral out of control? I read every comment and I love hearing your thoughts. Until next time, stay safe, stay skeptical, and I'll see you in the next story.